Fight fans, it's another episode of BTR Boxing Podcast. This is all about the nearly men of the heavyweight division. Now before we get into this episode, I want to direct your attention to our Patreon page. We've recently launched it and we're looking for that vital support to take the podcast to the next level. You can check us out at www.patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast Network. Now, there's 3 tiers in which you can select to be a patron, and you can get many benefits of being a patron, including early access to them episodes that we release. You can get them a few days early. We'll give you shout outs on social media, we'll give you shout outs on the podcast, and we'll even let you commission an episode for the podcast as well. So please go and check that out, www.patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast Network. So without further ado then, this is all about the great heavyweights that never won a world title. Welcome once again, fight fans, to another episode of BTR Boxing Podcast with me, your host, John Bastow, as always joined by Johnston Brown. For another one-off, really. This is going to be another special for you guys to listen to. We're really excited to be doing this one. It's something that we've discussed doing for a while. It's a topic that's always discussed by many boxing historians, and we thought we'd dip our toes in the water of this one and we'd have a conversation about some of the greatest heavyweights to never win a world title. There's so many fantastic heavyweights out there that we've discussed in certain episodes we've already done for the various series of the podcast, but they've never really came to light. They've never really had any more than a mention amongst some of the other great champions that we have covered before. So this is a perfect opportunity for us to actually sit down and really discuss some of these great names, and we've put together a brilliant list of some brilliant fighters. Some of them you probably will know really well, and some of them you might not be that privy to, so it's really going to be an informative and interesting episode for ourselves and hopefully for yourself as well. Johnston, you've done some great work putting some of the stuff together for this episode. I'm really excited about it. How much of a difference does it make sitting down to discuss heavyweights that never actually went on to win a world title but don't really get the recognition that they deserve?
Yeah, it's certainly different, and it's something that we've been thinking about, as you say, for quite a while. And it's been great looking through the history of the heavyweight division. It always is, and especially looking at guys that were close, just not close enough, or guys that were good enough, but they were just never recognised, and they just never got their shot. And I think this is a great chance for us to be able to bring some names like that, as you say. Some people may not necessarily know too well, and guys that would have been household names. To be quite honest with you, I honestly believe that, especially in the early days, when sort of the early 1900s in there, I do believe that there was several guys that would have been world champions, and we'll go through that. Yeah, great little episode, and hopefully we can capture everybody and we don't miss anyone out.
It's always difficult trying to capture every single fighter. There'll always be someone will pluck from the depths of the boxing history books and say that you've not covered this guy. So apologies in advance, fight fans, because I'm sure there's probably someone we've missed off for the episode. But then again, we might not have done, and we might have actually covered the best of the bunch. So the place that we're going to start is we're going to go all the way back to the very beginning, really, and discuss this chronologically and go through different eras of time with different particular fighters that never really went on to get that heavyweight crown, were close to doing it, or as Johnston said, were just never recognised as a worthy contender, although they were, in our eyes, worthy contenders. Now, it's going to start, first and foremost, with the world-coloured heavyweight championship, the only recognised heavyweight championship available to black people prior to Jack Johnson winning the world heavyweight title in 1908. Now, the title continued to exist until the reign of Joe Louis as universally recognised champ, as the colour bar against black heavyweights was enforced during and for a generation after Jack Johnson's reign as world champ. This era was dominated by John L. Sullivan, Gentleman Jim Corbett, Jim Jeffries, Jack Dempsey, Gene Tunney, and of course Jack Johnson, amongst a few others.
Yeah, it was, when you look at the lineal heavyweight championship, which is something I did sort of last year, and I enjoyed digging into the depth of what it was like, and there were so many fighters that just didn't get the chance because they were of a different skin. So we're going to start with a guy that I'm sure many people would know is Peter Jackson, the Black Prince. He had a career record of 42 wins, 5 losses, 3 draws, and 29 KOs. Now he debuted in 1882 and he last fought in 1899. He had a percentage record of 39%. He was Australian, and of course he was a heavyweight, and he stayed at heavyweight. He never dipped down into any other division. Now, he defeated a guy called George Godfrey in 1888 to win the World Coloured Heavyweight Championship. And Jackson repeatedly tried to secure a fight against the then world champion, who was the John L. Sullivan, the guy that was the bare knuckle champion that then become the first ever gloved champion. And obviously that was to no avail. And that was due to Sullivan referring to the colour bar, which was something they could do when a white guy become a world heavyweight champion. They could refer to the colour bar as a reason for not fighting other black world champions. And in doing so, this is something that apparently John L. Sullivan quoted, and he said, "I will not fight a Negro. I never have, and I never shall." And that's why he never got the chance to fight John L. Sullivan.
Now, on the 21st of May, 1891 in California, Jackson fought the future world heavyweight champion, James Corbett, with the bout going an astonishing 61 rounds before it was declared a no contest, as both boxers were basically too exhausted to continue, which I would imagine you would expect to be the case after going 61 3-minute rounds, if it was 3-minute rounds, but I'm assuming it was 61 3-minute rounds. I mean, you can't even get boxers to go 12 rounds these days, never mind 61.
It's crazy. I mean, that's why you got to love these old days. They didn't fuck about, did they?
They certainly didn't. Now, Jackson won the Australian heavyweight title and was the first to win the Commonwealth heavyweight title in 1882, holding that title until 1899, making only 2 defences. Now, he was knocked out by Jim Jeffries in 2 rounds when still fighting in his late 30s. Jackson actually went on to be posthumously inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990. So, yes, he was recognised in the International Boxing Hall of Fame, but he actually never became a legitimised world heavyweight champion. He only became the heavyweight champion of the coloured heavyweight championship, which they had back in that particular era. And again, it just makes you wonder what would have happened should Peter Jackson have that opportunity against John L. Sullivan. Would he have gone on to beat him and become that world champion? It's good to see that he did get recognised, though, for his feats in that era.
Yeah, it is, and I do believe he would have beaten John L. Sullivan up from the information you can source from the internet and the way he fought. I believe he had the ability to beat him, and I think that Sullivan knew that, and he kept away from him. That's just my opinion, but we'll never know. I do think he was good enough. So we'll move on to a guy that I'm sure many of us know, and that's Sam, the Boston Tar Baby Langford, who had a record of 180 wins, 29 defeats, 39 draws, and 124 knockouts. Sam Langford is a guy that it does go down as a legend of boxing, but didn't ever get that world title shot. Now, he debuted in 1903, and he last fought in 1926. He had a knockout ratio of 50%, and he was Canadian. Now, he fought at 5 different weight classes. It's incredible. He fought at lightweight, welterweight, middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight. I mean, could you imagine today a lightweight fighting and then fighting for heavyweight titles? Not necessarily the heavyweight title, but for the coloured title is incredible. And his highest weight recorded was actually 185 pounds. So he would have barely made cruiserweight today. He fought from, obviously, lightweight to heavyweight, defeating many world champions and legends in his time in each weight class. And it was reported that Langford did once touch gloves with his opponent, who protested, "It ain't the last round," and Langford responded, "'Tis for you, son," and knocked the fella out. Beautiful.
That's certainly one way to end a fight, by telling him you're going to knock him out. Reminds me of when Tarver said to Roy Jones he was going to knock him out. He said he got any excuses with son. Remember that? That's another particular incident. Yeah. This is the original version of it. It certainly is. Now, according to Jack Dempsey, he said, "I think Sam Langford was the greatest fighter we ever had," and he was famously dubbed the greatest fighter nobody knows by ESPN. Now, Langford was enshrined in the Ring Boxing Hall of Fame, Canada's Sports Hall of Fame in 1955, and the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990. So, as Peter Jackson once was, he was inducted, Sam Langford, and he's a fella that gets many stories told about him. I read an article on him quite recently in the Boxing News, and it was dead sad to read about his end to his life and his career. It really was. If you've not heard the story of Sam Langford after his boxing career, without spoiling it for you, I honestly genuinely recommend you go and read about it, because it's quite compelling as well as sad at the same time. But Sam Langford was a guy that we always sort of look at and say, you know, this is a guy that should have been a legitimate world champion. He should have had all these major fights with some of the major players at the time in the heavyweight division, but he just never got the opportunity to fight for that world title, which is such a shame. And a lot of it was due to racial segregation, and we know that was one of the reasons why they were fighting for the coloured world heavyweight championship rather than the world heavyweight championship. But Sam Langford, another great name to stick into this list of heavyweights that never actually won a world title. So, of course, we'll move on to the next one, who's another particular name of this era, and this is Joey Jeanette, who was 83, 10-10 with 69 coming by way of knockout. He debuted in 1904, and his last fight was in 1922. He had a 63% knockout ratio. He was an American. He was a heavyweight, of course. Now, opponents actually considered Jeanette, whose style reflected the inside punching style of the times, a dangerous inside boxer whom few wished to fight. Because of the racial barrier, he only had a small number of prospective opponents from which to choose, and often ended up getting matched against the same fighters over and over and over again. And ironically, Sam Langford was one of the fighters who Jeanette fought a total of 14 times, with Langford getting the better of him, winning 8 of their contacts, while Jeanette won 2, and the other 4 times were draws.
That's the one thing we obviously didn't speak about with Langford is the fact that he does have so many fights with all these guys on the list sort of in the early days, and hence why we didn't do it, because he gets mentioned a lot. So and obviously Langford was a champion, and so was Jeanette. And Jeanette, as you say, those wars with Langford, I mean, that was just something they had to do, I suppose. You know, if Sullivan and Colbert and all those guys and Fitzsimmons, they ain't going to fight them, then, you know, they're going to have to fight each other, and that's what they did. And Jeanette fought the future heavyweight champion of the world, who was Jack Johnson. He fought him a total of 10 times. Laz Langford fought him several times as well. And according to Ken Burns' documentary, Unforgivable Blackness, Jeanette lost twice, won 1 fight on a foul after 2 rounds, had 2 draws and 5 no decisions. Johnson called Jeanette the toughest man I ever fought. Jeanette then actually came out and criticised Johnson, because Jeanette was on the cusp of fighting Johnson, or people felt he would have been one of the first picks. Unfortunately, Johnson didn't pick him. So although we still had the white champions that were around at the time and they were fighting, they were not fighting the world coloured champions. When Johnson became champion, he did the same thing. He knew Jeanette, he knew Langford, and a few others we're going to speak about soon. He knew that he didn't want to face them, and that was basically because, you know, he thought he was going to lose. That's the simple reason. And Jeanette criticised Johnson by saying Jack forgot about his old friends after he became champion and drew the colour line against his own people. Jeanette was never allowed to fight for a heavyweight championship during his 15-year career, despite having a stellar record against opponents from all races as well. Now, Joe's memorable fight occurred in April 17, 1909 for the World Coloured Heavyweight Championship in a return bout with Sam McVeigh in Paris, France, that lasted 3.5 hours and 49 rounds. It's the longest boxing match of the 20th century and one of the greatest marathons in boxing history. After the 49th round, McVeigh could not rise from his stool at the call of time, and basically Jeanette was declared as the winner by a technical knockout. Now, one interesting fact I thought I'd pick up on is Wiki believed Jeanette fought 166 documented pro fights with 106 wins, 68 by knockout and 20 losses. Only 2 of those were by knockout as well, those 2 losses, once early in his career and once late in his career. And BoxRec accredited him with, as we mentioned, the 103, which he believed was actually more closer to 400, which I'm sure many of these fighters had loads and loads of fights. I mean, these guys would fight probably twice a week. These guys were not joking about, and it was only the big fights that went those 60, 40 odd rounds, which is ridiculous. But these guys, no doubt, fought over 400 to 500 fights. I absolutely believe that. And he was inducted in the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1997.
Yeah, I believe that as well. I believe they probably fought way more than what was ever recorded in history. It'd be interesting to know if that was, what really happened. It's just something that we're never going to really know about. But I do genuinely believe, like you, Johnson, that a lot of these guys did fight closer to sort of 300-400 fights throughout the course of their career, because that's just what that period of time was like. They'd fight anybody, anywhere, any place, anytime. They'd go for ridiculous amounts of rounds for hours on end, and it just makes you wonder, like, how these guys would go through that length of time fighting in the ring. I mean, 49 rounds. 49 rounds. For a fight is unbelievable. I mean, obviously the one earlier, 61 rounds, was just even more crazy, but still that amount of rounds is like fighting 3 or 4 times over in a standard 12-round fight in this day and age. It's absolutely crazy. So let's move on to another fighter, Harry the Black Panther Wills, who was 79-3 with 56 knockouts. He debuted in 1911 and last fought in 1932. With a 64% knockout ratio. Again, he was another American heavyweight and a 3-time world-coloured heavyweight champion. Now, Wills was ranked as the number 1 challenger for the world heavyweight title, but was denied in every opportunity to challenge for it. Out of all the black contenders, Wills came closest to securing that title shot, but it never came. Wills was set to face Jack Dempsey in 1926 in a title bout, but a dodgy boxing promoter who'd ascertained both fighters' signatures on a contract failed to produce the funds needed to secure Dempsey, which meant that the fight never happened.
Yeah, it seemed like it was going to happen. It was inevitable, and he was the closest. Now, there are 2 conflicting reports, because obviously you have this report where it is this dodgy fella that's just basically couldn't give Jack Dempsey the money. There are other reports that's also suggested that it was the governor of the state of New York who actually cancelled the contest, fearing the race riots would follow the fight. And that was from the race riots from when Jack Johnson won the World Heavyweight Championship and he became the first black heavyweight champion. And there was awful race riots. You could have a look yourself. I mean, it's in that there's a long documentary on Jack Johnson, which I've watched. I know you have, Sean, and the treatment of I can't even. It's just go and watch it. I advise anyone to go and watch it, and you can see what happened in his race riots. It was absolutely just dreadful. But for compensation, Wills actually received $50,000 for the cancellation. Wills obviously was confident that he would have won the match, but let's be honest, it would have been a real 50-50. Jack Dempsey against Harry Wills, who was a bit younger as well, Harry, than Jack. They were quite close. I think they would have been about mid-20s at the time, and it would have been a very interesting fight. It would have been, if they had fought 3 times, I think they both win 1, and then you have a decider. It was that close. But Wills fought Sam Langford. Again, we're going to mention Sam. This is why Sam always pops up. He fought him 22 times, winning 6, losing 2, with 14 no decisions. Although the 2 losses were by knockout, he beat Langford 3 times for the coloured heavyweight title, with Langford winning it back twice. Harry Wills also defeated coloured heavyweight champion Sam McVeigh 3 times and fought 2 no decisions bouts with Joe Jeanette, and he was inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame in 1992.
So all the no decisions on his record then, are we saying that these are the types of fights where they were just fighting for so long that basically they just called it off because no one was actually declared the winner? Is this what these no decisions are?
That's what I believe it is, because you used to have the newspaper decisions where the newspaper, so you'd have a fight, no one knows who won until the next morning when everyone picks up the newspaper and then the papers decide. But this one is 40 no decisions. Literally, I think they just got too exhausted. and it was going either way. Sometimes you had situations, from what I've read, where guys are beating the absolute living shit out of someone, but because he hasn't knocked him out, it goes to a no decision when they're both exhausted. It was a strange one. This is where the corruptness of it does come into play, where you have the governing, because he was never governed. I mean, it was illegal. Well, you couldn't even. It was completely illegal. Some of them were fighting on boats back then as well to make sure the police don't raid them, because that was another thing. The no decisions. That was the other thing, is the police would raid them as well. So there would have been a few police raids where they find out about the fight. There'd be a few rounds in, and then the police raids it. There's no decision. They go and fight again the next week somewhere else. So that's what I believe they were. It was a very unusual time.
So the next fighter who we've just briefly mentioned when talking about Harry Wills is Sam McVeigh, who had a record of 65 wins, 16 losses, 12 draws and 3 no contests, with 47 of them wins coming by knockout. Now he debuted again around this period of time, debuted in 1902 and last fought in 1921. Now he had a knockout percentage of 72%. Again, another American heavyweight. McVeigh actually ranked alongside Jack Johnson, Joey Jeanette, Sam Langford and Harry Wills as the top black heavyweights of their generation. Now his greatest wins include 2 victories over both Sam Langford and Harry Wills, as we've previously mentioned, which won him the World Coloured Heavyweight Championship on 2 separate occasions respectively. Now, on April the 17th, 1909, in Paris, Sam McVeigh fought Joe Jeanette in a bout considered one of the greatest and one of the longest of the 20th century. The fight went 50 rounds and lasted 3.5 hours, as we mentioned earlier. Now, many observers felt that McVeigh was winning most of the rounds, knocking Jeanette down repeatedly in the 21st and 22nd rounds. By the 40th round, Jeanette had recovered while McVeigh was lagging and was knocked down repeatedly himself. In the end, McVeigh's eyes swollen so badly that they were shut, and essentially he was forced to quit.
Yeah, I mean, these guys, they can fight 50 rounds and last 3.5 hours. It's crazy. It just builds. I mean, the fights were obviously not fast paced. It was going to be a slow pace, and it probably got a lot slower. And by the sounds of it, McVeigh was in control, and obviously his eyes, he ain't going to be able to see anymore by that round, and it finished. And Bert Sugar is obviously one of those historians that, he highly regarded these guys as the best fighters to never win world titles. And we know Bert Sugar is he was a fantastic historian, and God rest his soul, RIP to the man. And I love listening to Bert. He's always got a great story, and he spoke of this fight, and in his words, he said, "That had to be one of the greatest knockdowns, drag-out fights in the history of boxing. I don't think anybody wanted their money back after that fight. This was a cliffhanger. Every round, all 50 of them, cliffhangers. I mean, God, you could just imagine where he sourced this information. I mean, he would have spoken and been around these guys, not necessarily these guys, the ones before it, as a kid, as a youngster. So I'm sure he's got some stories that probably weren't necessarily true, but he knows his stuff, Bert. There's no doubt about it. And Sam McVeigh was actually inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1999 as well. So all of these fighters all fought each other numerous times. Some of them went crazy distances. They all had fought Jack Johnson. They had beaten Jack Johnson at times, all of them. They had lost a few. They had beaten him. He never gave him a chance. The guys before him never given a chance. But they all fought each other. They all beat each other. They all had these no contests, whether they were police raids or they just got exhausted. They couldn't continue. However it was. But these guys here, without a shadow of doubt, in my mind, if they were given opportunities against Johnson, against Sullivan, against Colbert, against Fitzsimmons, whoever, I believe one of these guys would have won the world title. So that's why these guys are at the forefront of why we're doing this, and they need to be addressed. And if no one knows about these fellas, there's so much more information out there. The reason why we're only giving you bits and bobs is because hopefully one day we'll get a career profile on one of these, Sean, and we can go into a lot more detail. Fantastic fighters, and definitely guys that would have been world champions without a doubt.
Don't you just wish that these heavyweights this day and age would do exactly what these heavyweights of that particular area would do? Just fight each other. Just stop with the bullshit and just fight each other. But obviously we've got too much of an involvement from promotions, TV deals, sponsorships, whatever it is in this day and age that is involved in making these fights in this 2020. But man, when you look at the 1900s there and you just think these guys just fought each other every day of the week and twice on a Sunday, and that was just how it was. It's just amazing that these guys went through that particular era and fought each other so many times, but such a shame that none of them got that shot at the World Heavyweight title. But it was also good to see that they was all posthumously inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame, the International Boxing Hall of Fame. So it was good to see that every single one of them had got that. Now, we're going to move on now from that particular era of time, and we're going to move on to the 1930s to the 1950s. So we're going between 1930s to 1950s. Now, with the title jumping at the time between Max Schmeling, Jack Sharkey, Primo Carnera, Max Baer, and James J. Braddock. Following Gene Tunney's retirement, Joe Louis dominated from 1937 to 1949, Ezard Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott from 1949 to 1952, and then, of course, Rocky Marciano from 52 to 56. We're going to give you a list of the fighters that came close, but of course, not close enough. And the first one on the list is Tony Pandy Terror Farr, who had a record of 86 wins, 35 losses, 19 draws, and 24 of them coming by way of knockout. Now, his debut was in 1926, and his last fight was in 1953. Now, his knockout percentage was only 17%, and it amazes you, doesn't it, that he won so many fights, but he's only got like 24 knockouts out of them, 86 wins on his records. Now, he was actually from the UK, he was from Wales, and he fought in the light heavyweight and heavyweight division, and became the British and Empire heavyweight champion on the 15th of March 1937. Now, he did challenge for the world title against Joe Louis and gave him one of the hardest fights of his career, hurting him numerous times and lasting the full 15 rounds on a way to a wide unanimous decision loss, with the referee awarding Louis the fight 13 rounds to 1, while the judges scored the fight 8-5 and 9-6, both in Louis' favour. Now, Tommy Farr lost a 10-round fight on January the 21st, 1938, against former heavyweight champion James J. Braddock. But he did have great success against a couple of big names in Tommy Loughran and Max Baer, both on points. So Tommy Farr is another name that many historians will refer to as a brilliant fighter, a fighter that, although didn't have that great percentage of knockout ratio, he would dance around the ring, he would absolutely outbox a lot of these fighters, and that's what he was known for at that particular period of time. Yes, he did win the British and Empire Heavyweight Championships. Yes, he challenged for the World Heavyweight title against Joe Louis, and he was close. It was close. You know, you can catch a lot of these fights are in black and white, and you can find them on the depths of YouTube, so it is worth going back and looking into it. But Tommy Farr then, again, another nearly man, but it's nice to see a nearly man coming from this side of the pond.
Yeah, the first one that's come up so far, and Tommy Farr, the reason why his career spanned so long as well is he lost his fortune. He had quite a bit of money, and he ended up losing it, having to go back. Hence why he had so many defeats on the record there. They all come towards the end of his career, but he did continue fighting some of the big guns, and obviously, you know, he was over. You know, he was old. He's going to lose those fights. He did actually end up buying a bar, I believe, or a restaurant in Brighton Pier as well, and he worked there for a little while. And he's another colourful character and a guy that, you know, if we do get a career profile, and he's definitely one we could do, and it'd be a great one to do, and an excellent fight. He just didn't get the opportunity, unfortunately. I mean, he did get the one shot against Joe Louis, but that's the trouble again. I mean, you just spoke about this era and how many titles. We've got 4 different titles, legitimate world heavyweight titles that we all consider to be world heavyweight titles. There was just one back then. You know, if there was 4 about then days, I'm sure Tommy Farr, as many others we're going to discuss, would have also been world champions as well.
So let's move on to another one then. Jimmy Cleveland Spider-Man Bivens, 86-25-1, 31 by way of knockout. He debuted in 1940 and last fought in 1955 with a 28% knockout ratio. And would you be surprised? He's another American. He's a light heavyweight and he was a heavyweight. Now, he began 1943 with a remarkable win against Ezard Charles, in which he recorded 7 knockdowns against the future heavyweight world champion.
Wow.
In 1942, he decisioned another future middleweight king in Billy Sues, a future light heavyweight champ Gus Lesnovich, and Joey Maxime, and heavyweight contenders Tammy Morello, Bob Pastor, and Lee Savold.
Yeah, and the thing is with Jimmy Bivens, he was a feared fighter, and in that light heavyweight division, I think it was definitely his strongest. It was when he got into sort of the 1942, 1943, where he was fighting at light heavyweight and heavyweight, and he was one of the best fighters around. There was no doubt about it. And in an unprecedented move by the Ring, they actually ranked Bivens in 1942 as the number one contender in heavyweight and light heavyweight at the same time. So you could just imagine how good Bivens was. We still don't know the reasons and the ins and outs of why Joe Louis never gave him a chance, but if he did, who knows what could have happened. I think Jimmy Bivens would have caused him all sorts of problems. Now, the streak he had continued in 1943 when Bivens posted wins over future world champions again, which you just mentioned, which is Hezard Charles, and he also beat a guy called Christoph. I ain't going to try and pronounce this guy's name. A guy called Murillo, light heavyweight contender. Lloyd Marshall, who's a guy we know well. Lloyd Marshall was another fella that was feared and no one wanted to fight. And then the heavyweight contender again in Lee Q Murray and the former light heavyweight champion Melo Bettina. Now these guys were all fantastic fighters. He's beaten them all. You know, he should have been given a shot. He just didn't get it. I mean, the Ring are crediting the guy at the time. Why he didn't get it, we don't know. Clearly, he was. We've done the mafia dark side of boxing, and I'm sure he would have been a guy that would have been pushed away. Maybe he didn't want to tango with the mafia. Who knows? There was something not quite right there. He did not only just because he obviously was a black guy as well, didn't help him, but Louis. I'm sure if it was down to Joe Louis, I love Joe Louis, he probably would have taken the fight. But I'm sure the people around him didn't fancy it, and he was definitely a world-class light heavyweight. There's no doubt about it. But he also showed from 1942 to February 1946 when Bivens went an unbeaten 26 consecutive bouts. He did go on a little bit too long again, as they all do, and he ended up picking up those defeats, the 25 defeats there, a lot of them coming at the end of his career. He was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1999, but again, Jimmy Bivens, for me, one of the best light heavyweights and one of the best heavyweights. And it was just unfortunate for him. He didn't get that chance.
No, and we're going on to another guy now. It's the same as well. It's crazy that this episode is bringing up so many of these names where the historians of the world, or the so-called historians of the world, or boxing Twitter will be listening to it and going, "Yeah, I know that guy. He was this. He was that. He was this." Well, this is the whole point of doing the episode, guys. It's so that we can give you an opportunity to then get a bit of a taster for what these fighters were, what they were about, and hopefully you'll kind of go off and do your own thing and do a bit of research into them, and you'll get a good satisfaction out of researching a lot of these fighters, because it's really great to sit down and really fascinating to find out information that you've never even heard was possible. Now, another fighter, as I mentioned, was Elmer Violent Ray, with a record of 97, 23 and 11, with 69 coming by way of knockout. His debut was in 1933 and he last fought in 1949. He had a 51% knockout ratio. He was also American. Now, Ray never fought for the title, but did fight the future heavyweight champion Hezard Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott. In 3 fights with Jersey Joe Walcott, Ray suffered a 3-round knockout. On September the 25th, 1937, he rebounded to outpoint Walcott on November the 15th, 1946, and lost the 3rd fight by decision on April the 3rd, 1947. Now, he defeated Hezard Charles on a split decision on July the 25th, 1947, but was knocked out in the 9th round of their rematch on May the 7th, 1948.
Another fighter that had these great fights with Hezard Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott, 2 guys that fought each other 4 times that they fought for the heavyweight championship. It might have even been 5 actually, or maybe I'm thinking it had 2 each, and I think it might have been 2 each and 4. I can't quite recall if it was 4 or 5 off the top of my head. But Hezard Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott, they held that world title sort of in between Joe Louis's era and Rocky Marciano's, and they fought them both. And these fellas were considered to be legends. And Elmer Ray should have been putting in there alongside them, should have been fighting these guys for the heavyweight titles. He never got the chance. It's just something that never happened. He fought for non-titles all the time. But another true, excellent fighter that just didn't get his opportunity. So we'll move on again. We'll move on to someone we'll all know well, and that's Archie, the old mongoose Moore. A record of 185, 23, 10 and 1 with 131 knockouts. Now, he debuted in 1935 and last fought in 1963 with a 60% knockout ratio. Of course, once again, he's another American guy on the list, and he was a middleweight, a light heavyweight, and a heavyweight. Now, at one point, he was the oldest boxer to win the light heavyweight championship, but he just never managed to capture that heavyweight title. And he has got a book out, and he does go into depth with this particular fight I'm going to talk about here. Now, this is more, and he came the closest he had ever come to winning that world heavyweight title on September 21st, 1955, when he faced the champion at the time, who was Rocky Marciano, in New York's Yankee Stadium. Now, after putting Marciano down in the second round, I believe it was the second time Marciano had been down in his career, and the last time he ever hit the deck, the champ did come back to knock Moore down 3 times officially. One was apparently ruled a slip before Moore was eventually floored for the full count in the 9th round. And there was a moment in this fight when he did put Rocky Marciano down, and Archie Moore is just livid with the referee at the time. The referee he takes an eternity. He starts grabbing his gloves. He shakes him a couple of times, and it's like he said when he shook him, he sort of like he woke him up. He wanted to jump on him. There was no standing 8 count. He gave him a standing 8 count. He shouldn't have. As soon as he rose to his feet, back then, a fighter was able, when returning to their neutral corner, to then go and attack, and he could have attacked him when Marciano was hurt. And Moore absolutely believes that if he was given an opportunity, he would have knocked out Marciano that night. And that was the one chance he had to become a world champion. It never happened. A heavyweight world champion, that is. He's absolutely livid. Seriously, I advise anyone to get the book or just have a look online and just read some of his interviews or watch. I think there might have been one on YouTube. He is just furious with this situation. He really believed he could have beaten Marciano that night.
Well, he did have another shot at the world title, but at this point in time, he's way past his best. He's way old. He was 39 years of age when he challenged for the world title against a 21-year-old Floyd Patterson, and he got stopped in 5 rounds. He's 39 years of age at this point in time. He's way past his best. I mean, come on, look at the amount of fights he's had. He's had over 200 fights in his career, and at 39 years of age, he's still going, and he's still challenging an 18-year-old younger fighter in Floyd Patterson. Now, he is only one of a handful of boxers whose careers spanned over 4 decades and was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990. Famous quote from Archie Moore, and he says, "I'm like the drunk in the bar who just wants one more for the road."
A brilliant quote, and that probably sums up his career, that he just didn't know when to stop. And obviously that Floyd Patterson fight, that was the Marciano title when he retired as well. That was the fight that Patterson picked up the title, and he did give Moore a bit of a battering, unfortunately. And Patterson picked up the title, and it just didn't happen. Two chances, didn't happen. A great fighter still, and now we move on to the mid 1950s and 60s, and obviously this was the time when Floyd Patterson, after beating Moore, he took on the mantle left by Marciano from 1956 to 1962. Before he was absolutely poleaxed, as we've mentioned before, by a certain Sonny Liston, and then Muhammad Ali, aka Cassius Clay, aka Muhammad Ali at the time, then took over before his exile, which was from 1962 to 1967. And this is a list of those guys that were around at the time. Once again, the nearly men that came very close.
So the first one on the list is somebody that we've covered quite recently on our Career Profiles podcast. It's Sir Henry Cooper, our Henry. It was a great episode to do on Henry Cooper, and I would highly recommend that you go and listen to that episode to get more of an insight about how good of a man and a fighter he was. Now, his debut was in 1954, and he last fought in 1971. He had a record of 40, 14 and 1 with 27 by way of knockout, 49% knockout ratio. Of course, he's the first Englishman to come on this, the first Englishman to come on this episode. It's been all Americans with one Welshman so far. We've now got an Englishman in Sir Henry Cooper, who was a heavyweight for his professional career. Our Henry, he was known for his power left hook, his Henry's hammer, and it was his signature shot that knocked down a young Cassius Clay. Cooper held the British Commonwealth and European heavyweight titles several times throughout his career, becoming the only fighter to win 3 Lonsdale belts outright, a feat that will probably never be repeated again. Now, Henry's one and only unsuccessful challenge at the World Heavyweight Championship came in 1966 against Muhammad Ali, losing on cut. So this was the rematch from their original fight when he was known as Cassius Clay. He did rematch him and he had the world title, and this was when he went on to lose to Muhammad Ali on cuts, and it's quite a bloody fight, this one as well. One that you can check out on YouTube. He gets cut to shreds in this particular fight, but he was always known, as we did cover in that episode for Career Profiles, to get cuts in most of his fights throughout his career. Now, Henry Cooper was ready to fight for the WBA Heavyweight Championship against Jimmy Ellis here in the United Kingdom, even though the British Boxing Board of Control refused to recognise the fight as a world title bout, with the British Boxing Board of Control affiliated with the WBC, who stated that they would only recognise a fight between Joe Frazier and a suitable contender. Now, the fight was postponed a couple of times and eventually cancelled because Cooper injured his knee, and if only he would have got that shot, who knows, would he have become a world heavyweight champion? God only knows. I mean, we genuinely believe that I think he probably could have gone to become a heavyweight champion, but we'll just never know. Of course, Henry was the first boxer to win the public vote for the BBC Sports Personality of the Year award twice, and is the only boxer to be awarded a knighthood.
Sir Henry Cooper is an absolute legend. And I really enjoyed doing that career profile show. And it was a good one, and definitely highly recommend anyone to listen to it. And we didn't mention the Jimmy Ellis things. That's why I thought it was good to stick that in, something that we didn't mention in that career profile. So it was just a fight that didn't happen for him, and then he gets injured. I think for me, looking at Jimmy Ellis and looking at Cooper, I think Cooper was all wrong for him. I think he could have got rid of him. We'll never know. And obviously, the chance against Cassius Clay or Ali, if he'd have put him down, he could have fought Liston. Who knows how that would have gone? That would have been interesting. Another guy that definitely, I respect very highly, and one that was close, just no cigar. And so we'll move on now to next guy was Eddie Machen. Now, he was 50-11-3 with 29 knockouts. He debuted in 1955 and last fought in 1967. He had a 45% knockout ratio. And once again, we'll go back to the Americans. Heavyweight, always a heavyweight, never fought in any other weight. And in 1965, Machen received his first world title shot when he met Ernie Terrell for the vacated WBA title that had been stripped from the Muhammad Ali in his exile. And Terrell unfortunately come away with a win that day, and he won by a 15-round decision. Machen then defeated Joe Maxim twice. He drew Zora Foley, Cleveland Williams, before outpointing Jerry Quarry by unanimous decision in 1966. Some fantastic names there, proving his credibility. Now, Machen was the only man to go the 12-round distance for the first time and the only time against Sonny Liston when he was literally bulldozing his way through opponents in 1960. In late 1966, Machen fought the young future heavyweight champion Joe Frazier and lost a 10th round technical knockout. Now, them names there, we've just pulled out of the hat from Machen's career. Just shows you the level he was fighting against, and all of those names were all fantastic fighters.
Now, the next fighter on the list is certainly one that I've always felt was an uncrowned champion. It's Zora Foley, who was 79-11-6 with 44 wins by way of knockout. He debuted in 1953, last fought in 1970 with a 46% knockout ratio. American heavyweight, boy, they had some great heavyweights, the Americans, over the past 80 years. It's just got really shit over the past 20 years, hasn't it? they've had such a reign on the heavyweight division, and then all of a sudden, in the last 20 years, they've just not really had the heavyweights they once had. Well, Deontay Wilder's probably the exception to the rule, but other than that, the heavyweight division for the Americans is just nowhere near as good as it was once. But Zora Foley, look at the contenders he beat. I'm going to list them now. The contenders he beat was Eddie Machen, who we just spoke about, George Chuvalo, Bob Foster, our own Henry Cooper, and Oscar Bonavena. But despite the fact that he was considered a top contender, he never got a World Heavyweight Championship shot against the champion at the time, who was Floyd Patterson. And one of Foley's best performances came against Henry Cooper in their rematch, where he showed he certainly had some pop in his shots by knocking out the British favourite in two with a shot that he never saw coming. It is something we did cover in that Career Profiles episode. It was one of them shots that was just like a shot sent from the gods, as they say. He just literally caught Henry Cooper with a great shot, sparking him clean out. Now, it was not until March 22nd, 1967, aged 34, that he fought for a World Heavyweight title against Muhammad Ali. Now, before their fight, Ali joked that Foley was such a nice man that it posed a real problem because he could not possibly get mad at him. Well, Ali certainly did find his killer instincts, and he stopped Foley by knockout in the 7th round.
Zora Foley, for me, what a fantastic fighter he was, and And really, Patterson, he should have got that Patterson fight and Custamato. I think he robbed Zora Foley of that. Zora Foley should have been a world heavyweight champion. I believe he had Pat again. I just feel that looking at Foley and looking at Patterson, I think Foley would have beaten him. Just as my opinion there. In mysterious circumstances, Foley actually suffered a severe head injuries in a motel swimming pool while visiting a friend in Tucson, Arizona on July 8th, 1972, and he died at the age of 41 in a local hospital shortly afterwards. Now, the death was officially ruled to be accidental, but conspiracy theories regarding it still persist. A tragic end for Zora, and another name. I mean, all of these guys, although they're not world champions, you look at the guys they fought, they might as well have fought for world titles. And as you know, we're going to keep saying, but if there's 4 world titles back then, he would have definitely fought one of them for one of those titles. Yeah, tragic ending for Zora, and what a great fighter. So we'll move on to the next guy, Cleveland Big Cat Williams. 80, 13 and 1 with 60 KOs, debuted in 1951, last fought in 1972, had a 64% knockout ratio, and of course another American heavyweight. Now, a Ring Magazine poll actually rated him as one of the finest boxers never to win a world title, as many of these on the list are, but the Ring obviously magazine pointed out that Cleveland Big Cat Williams was a real talent. Williams was actually knocked out by Liston on April 15, 1959 after hurting Liston early and breaking Liston's nose, but was stopped again by Liston within 2 rounds in their rematch on March 21st, 1960. He did draw with a guy we had on the list, Eddie Machen, on July 10, 1962, and he also dropped a split decision on March 13, 1963 to Ernie Terrell. Cleveland Big Cat Williams, another great fighter on the list. Yeah, one that he was just unfortunate again. 1 world title. This is why people talk about 1 world title, but the list in these sort of eras is huge, and the names are so significant that you sort of, in a way, as I was doing this, the one thing I will say is I was sort of feeling sorry for these fellas that there was only 1 world title. We're screaming for it, but in actual fact, maybe just having at least another 1 in there, maybe not 4, but another 1, just to help some of these absolute legends of the sport where they could have actually picked up that world title.
Definitely, I agree with you. Most of them would have been a world champion if there would have been as many belts as there are around today. But then again, would they have all fought each other? Probably not, and that's the shit thing about boxing today, of course. Now, we're going to move into the golden era of the heavyweight division, the 1970s, and we're also going to touch on the 1980s. Now, the 1970s was a decade that was ruled by Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. Larry Holmes, of course, then took over from 78 to 85 before Mike Tyson ruled the division in the late 80s. Now, there were many excellent fighters that would have become world champions in any other era. Now, here's a list of just some of those guys. And the first one on the list, Ken Norton. Man, what a fighter. Ken, the Black Hercules, the Jawbreaker, and the Fighting Marine Norton. He was a fantastic fighter. Someone we enjoyed covering for our Legendary Nights. Ironically, against Larry Holmes. The last episode of Season 1 of Legendary Nights. Go and check that out. Ken Norton and Larry Holmes. Great fight. He had a record of 42-7-1 with 33 by way of knockout. He debuted in 1967 and last fought in 1981 with a 66% knockout ratio. And again, another American heavyweight. Now, it's a strange story that we're about to tell you now. Norton actually held the WBC heavyweight title from 1977 to 1978. He never actually won it in the ring, which is the reason why he's been put into this list of nearly men, because although officially on record he was a world heavyweight champion, he never won it in the ring. He was gifted the world heavyweight title, I mean, he never actually won it, and he lost it. when he got the world heavyweight title, he lost it in his first defence. So really, when you think about it, he never actually went and won the world heavyweight title in the ring. Of course, his best fights was the trilogy against Muhammad Ali, in which Norton won the first by split decision and controversially lost the other 2 fights by a split decision and a unanimous decision, respectively. He fought that classic slugfest, as we've said, in 1978 with Larry Holmes, narrowly losing a split decision. And as I rightly pointed out, it was the last episode of Season 1 for our Legendary Nights podcast. Go and check that out. But Ken Norton, although he had the WBC heavyweight title from 77 to 78, lost it in his first defence, he never won it in the ring. He never actually won the world heavyweight title in the ring. So for us, that kind of justifies putting him in there as an early man.
Absolutely does. He never won in the ring, and he openly said that. I've read his book. he's 100%. He does not feel he was ever really a world champion. He felt like he beat the best when he beat Muhammad Ali that first fight, and he was so devastated with that third fight, which he believed he won. Another very close fight. All three were very close, and he was just Muhammad Ali's. It was his bogeyman. He just had the tools to cause Muhammad Ali all sorts of problems. You know, he got blazed, didn't he, by George Foreman, which is something we went through. We could have spoken about several other fights. We're just talking about those close opportunities for Ken. And unfortunate, again, I mean, that Larry Holmes fight was a very good fight, very close fight. I think Holmes did win it, but it was very close. Norton could have nicked that night. It was just one of those things. But yeah, he makes a list. These are all fighters that never won a world title inside the ring. So that's why Norton is 100% in this list, and he deserves to be. And so we'll move on to the next guy, and he was a fantastic character, an Argentinian, who was Oscar Ringo Bonavena. 58, 9 and 1 with 44 knockouts, debuted in 64, last fought in 76, 65% knockout ratio. As I say, Argentinian, the first and only Argentinian on the list. Now, Bonavena first came to worldwide public attention after a fine performance defeating rated contender and Canadian champion George Chuvalo. Before that, in only his 8th fight, he actually lost a 10-round decision against Zora Foley. In his 8th fight, he fought Zora Foley. That is some terrible matchmaking from his team there. Don't know what on earth they were thinking. Obviously, didn't do their own work on Zora. So that was his. Understandably, Zora was, as we just spoke about, a fantastic fight. He did go the distance in 1966 against a young Joe Frazier as well in their first meeting. And he even put him down twice in a second before Frazier managed to squeeze out a very narrow decision. Now, that fight for Joe Frazier was a real learning curve for him that night. He really did get away with one. He was put down and he had to fight back, but Oscar Bonavena caused him a headache, and he was just a great fight. I mean, do you remember that fight, Sean? What a great performance that was from Oscar Bonavena. He was very close to beating Joe Frazier, not world champion. If he had beaten him, it may have taken Frazier a bit longer to win that world title as well.
Now, 2 years later in the rematch, Bonavena didn't have that same success, and he actually lost a unanimous decision over 15 rounds with the New York State Athletic Commission heavyweight title up for grabs on that particular night. So Joe Frazier did learn from that first fight and gone in and beat him in the rematch that they had. Now, in 1970, he lost the chance to win the NABF heavyweight title fight when he was stopped in the 15th by a certain Muhammad Ali. In what was a great build-up, Oscar Bonavena, there's a great clip of him giving some shit to Muhammad Ali in the build-up to it, and you can actually see him getting under Muhammad Ali's skin. Muhammad Ali, for one of the first times in his whole career, you actually see him getting really, really pissed off. And you don't see that because he's the one playing all the mind games usually. But Bonavena, for some reason, just got under his skin, and it's again compelling to watch, given that Ali was the master of the mental mind games, of course. Now, Bonavena's last 2 losses came against Floyd Patterson and Ron Lyle, both by decision, but again, another great fighter that never got the opportunity. Well, he did get the opportunity, he just never became a world champion because he's just that little bit not good enough to beat the great guys of that era. You know, we got the Joe Frazers and the Muhammad Ali's, and he did beat, obviously, Chuvalo, as we spoke about, but he went in and got beat off Foley in what was obviously terrible matchmaking, but he was just one of them fighters that, like you said at the start when we discussed this golden era, if there was more titles around, guys like Oscar Bonavena would have been a champion.
Absolutely would have been, and I know it is difficult because we do moan about it as well, so you sort of find myself a bit of a hypocrite here and going back on it, but when you do look at this list, it does really, you can imagine how hurt they must have been. They very rarely get a chance. They have to, not only do they have to, just to get the opportunity to fight the world champion was hard because of the amount of good contenders, excellent contenders that are around that they had to get through before they even got the chance. It was so difficult. That's why all these fellas are always the guys that you're always being mentioned as the best heavyweight that had never, ever won a world title. And Oscar was certainly one of them, a fantastic fighter. And I'll let you introduce the next guy because he's a guy that was brought up when we done our heavy hitters and he didn't make the list because we done it by decades, didn't we? Yeah. So, a guy that definitely finally gets another mention. It does get a mention in Legendary Nights, but I'll let you introduce this man, Sean.
Oh, this is, of course, the Black Destroyer, Ernie Shavers. Arguably the hardest hitting heavyweight of all time. From most of the fights that he got in the ring with, he had a record of 74-14 and one with 68 by way of knockout, which just tells you straight away how much of a knockout artist he was. Now, he debuted in 1969, and he actually last fought in 1995. His knockout ratio was 76%, another great American heavyweight. Shavers fought Muhammad Ali at Madison Square Garden on September the 29th, 1977 for the WBA, the WBC, the ring and the lineal heavyweight titles. Now that was a really tight fight, and Shavers actually hurt Ali pretty badly with an overhand right in the second before coming on strong again in the 13th round, and he battered Ali all around the ring in the 14th, but it just wasn't enough because in between all them rounds, Ali managed to do what he does best, which is to move around and just pick these fighters off while they were trying to make their way on the inside. Ali would later say that Shavers was the hardest puncher he has ever faced, stating, "Ernie hit me so hard, it shook my kinfolk back in Africa." A quote he also said about Henry Cooper as well. Now, on March the 23rd, 1979, in a mandatory title eliminator, he knocked out the former champion, Ken Norton, in the first round in what was probably the best win of his career. Shavers then fought for the world title against champion Larry Holmes at Caesars Palace Paradise on September the 29th, 1979. Shavers knocked Holmes down in round 7, but was stopped in round 11 after taking punishment, and Holmes later said that Shavers had one of the hardest punches he'd ever taken in his whole career.
Yeah, he was definitely a big puncher, wasn't he, Ernie? And if you could last, you could probably get away with it. I think his power dipped the further you go in, but he was just getting through those early stages. I suppose a bit like a George Foreman, really. That sort of guy that, you know, if you could, and even Mike Tyson, you know, you take these fellas into sort of the championship rounds, as they call it. They're the times when you win the fight. You've got to avoid them in the early exchanges because when they hit you, they do hit you, and certainly Ernie was one of the toughest punchers in boxing. And Angelo Dundee actually told Sports Illustrated in the mid-1970s article, he said he, as in Shavers, can get you out of there with any kind of shot. So he could throw rights, he could throw hooks, he could throw any combination you want, any sort of shot that he could probably knock you out of a jab. He was that strong, Ernie, and a fantastic fighter. And one, again, it's hard to believe that, you know, I always, from back in the day when I heard Ernie Shavers, I just assumed he was a world champion. Unfortunately, again, another guy that would have been if there were more titles. Unfortunate for him, a great fighter, Ernie.
Now, moving on to another fighter of that particular era was Jerry Irish Quarry, who had a record of 53-9-4, 32 by way of knockout. He debuted in 1965, last fought in 1992, 48% knockout ratio, again, American heavyweight, defeated Floyd Patterson by a majority decision. He also beat Buster Mathis, Ron Lyle, and Ken Norton in the first meeting, and his best victory, of course, and he beat and stopped Ernie Shavers in the first round in what was a certain shock upset against Ernie Shavers. But he did lose to Jimmy Ellis by a majority decision in the final of the WBA heavyweight tournament. So that was his opportunity to go on to become a world heavyweight champion. Now, this was at the time when Muhammad Ali was in exile, and he was looking at putting this little tournament on to crown this new world heavyweight champion, and the opportunity, it went a little bit awry for Jerry Quarry, but he was a guy that shared the ring with a lot of fighters. He was used so much as a sparring partner. He actually fought 3 times for the New York State Athletic Commission heavyweight title when he was stopped by Joe Frazier in 7, Ali in 7, and Norton in 5 rounds. He basically fought the best, and he just come up short when facing the very best.
He absolutely did. Another good name on the list, and to defeat guys like Patterson and Buster Mathis, who was another good fight. He was a bit heavy when he busted, but he could box, mate, and he was trouble for anyone. And Ron Lyle, Ken Norton, I mean, all fantastic displays. And to stop Ernie Shavers, definitely his best win. A great win for Jerry Quarry. And so we'll move on to the next guy, and we're just going to briefly touch on something before that happened, before he even stepped into the ring. But this is Ron Lyle, who was 43-7-1 with 31 knockouts. Now, he debuted in 1971, last fought in 1995. 61% knockout ratio, and of course another American. Now, at the age of 19, Ron Lyle was actually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 to 25 years in Colorado State Penitentiary, and was finally released after serving 7.5 years. A horrific start for Ron Lyle. It was a guy that got stabbed, and apparently someone else stabbed him, but he got done for it. I think he was like, the reason why it was second degree is because they felt like he was an accomplice to it. He was involved in gangs, unfortunately. Young 19-year-old, very silly and obviously in a difficult background. And he picked up an impressive victories over the guy I just mentioned, Buster Matthews, by a knockout, one unanimous decision over the WBA heavyweight champion or former WBA heavyweight champion Jimmy Ellis, and outpointed Oscar Bonavena. Now, after suffering only 2 defeats against Jerry Quarry and Jimmy Young, Lyle was given a world title shot against Muhammad Ali, the guy that always comes out, gives them all their chances. That every one of them, when they do get a chance, it tends to be against this man, Muhammad Ali. May 16, 1975. Lyle fought well and was only behind by 1, and even on the other 2 judges' scorecards going into the 11th of a 15-round fight. Unfortunately, Lyle was overpowered and unable to block the incoming punches until the referee stopped the contest.
Now, in his next fight, Lyle recovered from a second-round knockdown to go on to stop Ernie Shavers in 6, but then lost the 1976 Ring Magazine Fight of the Year against George Foreman when challenging for the NABF heavyweight title. Now, many consider this fight to be one of the most exciting and brutal in heavyweight history. Foreman spoke of this fight by saying, "No one beyond Sonny Liston ever stood up to me. Everybody would have to run, hide and cover up. No one stood up to me, but Ron Lyle decided I ain't gonna run, and he hit me so hard it didn't even hurt. There I was on the canvas thinking, what excuse are you gonna have now? I had to get up, but when I got up, he knocked me down again. He beat me so bad. After a while, he fainted and I won the fight. That was my most memorable night, because I kept on thinking, why am I here?" Now that is a fight that is brilliant to watch on YouTube. Guys, if you've not watched this fight, brilliant, so exciting, so exciting.
Yeah, and Ron Lyle, I mean, the one and only guy that really stood up to. I mean, we know Ali with the old rope-a-dope, but he didn't rope-a-dope him. He was standing in the ring and trading with George Foreman, and you know, we all know how much of a big puncher Foreman was. Wow, I mean, you can't deny Ron Lyle coming so late into the game, learning his trade in prison. Sort of similar to Norton, where he was good all rounder as well, but unfortunately he was in prison, whereas Norton was in the Marines. You know, you can't really in a way you can sort of compare the two because of the regimented the style of it. But Ron Lyle, yeah, another terrific fighter, and you know, for someone like George Foreman to speak so highly of you, you know that you are no mug.
So let's move on then to another fighter of that particular era, Jimmy Young, 35-18-3, 11 by way of knockout. He debuted in 1969 and last fought in 1990. He only had a 19% knockout ratio and was another American heavyweight. Young was known for his awkward defensive style and counterpunching. He drew with Ernie Shavers in their rematch after being knocked out in the first meeting, and he actually outpointed Ron Lyle twice. His biggest victory came in March of 1977 against George Foreman in San Juan, Puerto Rico. It was a hard-fought victory where Young demonstrated his excellent boxing ability while coming through some particularly hairy moments. Now, the ring named the Young-Foreman bout its 1977 Fight of the Year. Young joined Ali as one of the only 2 men to beat Foreman before his retirement in 1977. Young had one opportunity to fight for the WBA, WBC World Heavyweight titles against Muhammad Ali, but he did lose a unanimous decision on April the 30th, 1976. Again, you know, Jimmy Young's just another fighter of this particular era who, if he would have been around when there was 4 titles, he probably would have been one of the fringe world champions, because he was a guy that, he was good, but he just wasn't good enough to beat all of the very best fighters. Although that victory over George Foreman, it was earned, but I don't think George Foreman was right in his mentality at the time. When you look back at documentaries of George Foreman, you can see that after losing to Ali, he was never the same man at that particular time. He was in a really angry mindset, and there's one particular story of him literally losing his shit in the changing rooms, and it's a shame that people do tar that victory for Jimmy Young over George Foreman as that, but for me, he earned that victory over him.
He did, and then, yeah, that moment of Foreman, was he went around butt naked when he in the dressing room shouting prayers or something. He wasn't. Ali basically mentally destroyed Foreman, and that's why it took him so long to recover. But he came back and he became a world champion again. So we'll move on. Joe Bugner, 69-13-1 with 41 KOs. Debuted in 67. Last fought in 1999. A long career for Joe, and 49% of them by coming away a knockout. And he was born Hungarian, come to Britain, lived in Britain, and then immigrated to Australia. So that was Joe Bugner. He was another heavyweight. Joe, obviously, and no other weights he fought at. Joe Bugner, his stock rose when he defeated Sir Henry Cooper to win the British, Commonwealth and EBU heavyweight titles in 1971. It was a close fight, one that we have mentioned in Henry Cooper's career profile. Some believe that Henry deserved it. It was a very young Joe Bugner. I think he was like 19. He eventually got it. Harry Gibbs gave him the decision, and many felt that it should have gone the other way. But his stock rose internationally, but on the British shore, it's probably the reason why he probably immigrated to Australia is because we didn't like him for it. So it ain't really his fault, the poor fella. But he did fight Muhammad Ali, and he fought Joe Frazier back to back as well in 1973, losing both by a points decision. He then outpointed Jimmy Ellis before losing to Ali again in his only world title shot. After their bout, Ali declared that Bugner was capable of being a world champion, with Angelo Dundee echoing those sentiments. But it was never to be. He also fought and lost to Ron Lyle, Ernie Shavers, and he also fought against a very young Frank Bruno and lost that as well. But Joe Bugner is another guy that could have potentially won a world title. Some people actually underestimate Joe Bugner. When they look at his career, he wasn't great to watch. He didn't really have the personality. I think that's probably what his biggest problem was. But albeit to go back to back with Ali Frazier before Thriller and Manila, wow, I mean, you can't knock it. That's exceptional on its own. And he gave him problems. And Ali, the second time, even said, this guy's going to be a world champion. Wasn't to be.
Now, the last one that we've put on the list of that particular era is Jerry Gentleman Cooney, 28-3, with 24 coming by way of knockout. He debuted in 1977, last fought in 1990, with a 77% knockout ratio. In fact, I think he's actually got the biggest knockout ratio so far on the list out of all the fighters we've actually covered over the years. Again, another American heavyweight. Twice challenged for the World Heavyweight title. In 1982, he was knocked out by Larry Holmes in the 13th, and then in 1987, he was knocked out by Michael Spinks in 5 rounds. I think his greatest performance came when he knocked out Ken Norton in the first round in 1981, and then he also beat 2 notable names in Ron Lyle and Jimmy Young, both by knockout. So all these names, they're all interlinked with each other. Everyone that we've covered in this era, it just goes to show you that they didn't duck anybody. They fought everybody. Everybody fought everybody. And that's what I love. And that's why it's been called the Golden Era. That's why they refer to it as the Golden Era, because everybody fought everybody. Just like in the early 1900s when you had your Joe Ginetts, when you had your Jack Johnsons, your Sam Langfords, your Sam McVeighs all fighting each other. This was another era where everybody just got in the ring with everybody. Nobody shy away from a challenge.
And that's what it's all about. That's what we want to see today. And we need these guys of this era to take a leaf out of all their book, because they really did put on a show, and it was when boxing was great. And that's the way it is. And if heavyweight boxing is great, sort of the rest of the boxing sort of filters down, doesn't it? And hopefully it can happen. I mean, hopefully we're just not clutching at straws with this, but they all interlink, every single one of them, this golden era. Every one of them fought everybody. They've all beat each other, and they all like to fight each other to get that opportunity to if they get through that as a contender, to fight the champions. It was just unfortunate. It was always Muhammad Ali. It's just, what do you do? The greatest of all time. I mean, if there was any other time to just take him out of that, for some of these fellas, the title would have been changing to and fro. I mean, I know Frazier gets mentioned and Foreman gets mentioned a few times, but those 3 were just formidable. They really were. And so we're going to move on to the 1990s and onto the 2010s. These are 2 names that we'll know. This is an era where we probably could have thrown in a few more, but in terms of this list, I honestly believe there weren't many. This is just my honest opinion on it. But they were some of the greatest heavyweight champions that ruled those 20 years of heavyweight boxing. Names like Evander Holyfield, Riddick Bowe, Mike Tyson and Lennox Lewis from 1990 to 2004. And then after that, it was the Klitschko brothers, Vitaly and Vladimir, that took over from 2004 to 2015. And here are 2 guys that could have. It was just unfortunate, to be fair. I mean, these are 2 guys that deserve to be on the list. They were close, but just not close enough.
So the first one is David Chua. David Chewerman Chua, 52-5-2, 43 by way of knockout. Debuted in 1992 and last fought in 2013, 73% knockout ratio, and the first fighter from New Zealand on the list. Now, he actually beat John Ruiz in the WBC International Heavyweight title in 1996 and retained it 3 times until losing it for the first time to Ike Iwabuchi in 1997. A year later, Chua won the IBF Intercontinental and USBA heavyweight titles in a forgotten gem of a fight against Hasim Rahman, great fight that, knocking out The Rock in the 10th round. Now, Chua fought his one and only time for the WBC, IBF and IBO heavyweight titles in November 2000 and went the 12-round distance but lost on points by a wide margin to Lennox Lewis. Now, after losing to Chris Bird in 2001, Chua then went on to knock out Michael Moore in 1 round. He drew with Rahman in the rematch. He almost got a shot at the IBF heavyweight title, which was held by Vladimir Klitschko in 2007, but that fight never actually materialised. And in 2009, Chua captured the WBO Asia Pacific and WBO Oriental heavyweight titles against Shane Cameron and defended the titles twice. Absolutely phenomenal puncher of his time that just... He wasn't able to get the shots off against them elite heavyweights. When he came up against Lennox Lewis knew how to beat him. And that was, I think, David Chewa's problem, is that he wasn't able to use that size disparity that he had. You know, he wasn't able to use it to his advantage against the bigger guys like the Lennox Lewises of the era. That victory over John Ruiz in 1996, oh my God, stunning first round knockout that.
Yeah, he really could hit Chua, and if you allow him to get close enough, he'll knock you out. And he probably would have done that if Lennox Lewis given the opportunity. It wasn't going to happen. I mean, if he had fought Klitschko, it would have been a pretty dominant display from Klitschko. I honestly believe that it was just a size difference from Chua. If you don't allow him to get close enough to you, you're fine. And if you're savvy enough and clever enough, like guys like 2 of the greatest heavyweights at keeping their range was Klitschko and Lewis. It was never, he was never going to get really any chance. And if that Klitschko fight, I think he would have just gone the same way as the Lewis fight did. He was always dangerous, though. Always good to watch because you just thought if he can get away that shot, it could change. So the last one on this list is a long list. It's the last one, and it's Ike, the President Iwabuchi, who was 20-0, the only undefeated heavyweight on here with 15 KOs. Now, he debuted in 1994, last fought in 1999, and he had a 75% knockout ratio. He was from Nigeria, the one and only Nigerian heavyweight on the list. Now, he defeated the highly ranked David Chua in 1997, and he won the WBC International heavyweight title in the process. He beat future world champion Chris Bird. Now, after compiling a record of 20-0 and 15 knockouts, which is his record as it stood, Iwabuchi's life went into chaos, and he was eventually sentenced to 2 to 10 years for battery with intent to commit a crime, from which he was later paroled, and in 3 to 20 for attempted sexual assault. With the sentences to be served consecutively, he basically spent a long time in prison. It was an issue in a Vegas hotel, I think it was at the Mirage Hotel, where he got a prostitute to strip for him, or it wasn't a prostitute, she was a stripper. She went to strip for him. He tried to put hands on her, she didn't like it. And then she locked herself in the cupboard or something. He tried to drag her out. Then he locked himself in the bathroom. And then the police come and they use pepper spray to get him out of the bathroom. He was suffering with bipolar disorder. He believed he actually was the president of Nigeria, or actually the president of America, I believe. He was very, very unwell mentally. He had mental issues, bad ones. And the people around him, they didn't give a shit. They didn't look after him. And they were hoping he was going to be this big star and fight some of the best fighters around at the time. He has to make the list because we just don't know what would have happened with Iwabuchi. If he hadn't had this disorder, would he have gone on to be a heavyweight champion? Quite possibly. He was quite ruthless in the fight against Chua at times. And yeah, interesting guy. Very interesting guy. And it rounded up the list quite nicely.
It does round the list up quite nicely. I think he's a guy who's forgotten about because of, obviously, the bad thing that happened outside of the ring. And you forget about how much of a fantastic puncher he was in the ring when he fought, and the way he was en route to potentially fight for that world title. And like you said, who knows? Would he have become a world champion? I think so. I think he would have done, because at that time, obviously, there was about 3 titles around at the time, 4 titles around at the time. And then you had some of your minor championships like your WBFs and your WBUs. So So would he have become a world champion in some capacity? Absolutely. I 100% definitely think that he would have become a world heavyweight champion in some capacity in one of the organisations. It was just a shame that his life took a turn the way it did. So that rounds up the list of all the fighters over the past, 120 years of boxing, which is crazy when you put it like that. And we've read about some of the great fighters of different eras, of different times that should have probably been world champions or were close to becoming world champions or never got the shot at becoming a world champion. And there's some great names that we've covered in the episode. It's been an absolute pleasure, of course. Now, there is a list that you've put together, Johnston, and I'd like you to go through that list for the listeners and for the benefit of them to sort of just explain to them what you've done on this list that we've got, which we'll put in our show notes to show people, how we think certain things would have gone for these fighters, potentially they have got their shots at world heavyweight titles.
Yeah, so I think what we originally, when we was going to do this, we was going to sort of stick in a top 10 and our top 10 best ever heavyweights to never win a world title. And it was so difficult going through the names here. How can you pick 10 fighters? So I thought it was only right that we just literally get a list together of all the fighters that we believe were good enough and they needed to be mentioned. So we've done that. And then I think the next part was literally just splitting them off and picking off sort of the 10 fighters that I believe would have been a world champion if things had have been slightly different. And I think the thing this is going to be 10 names, but it's not in necessarily a 1 to 10 order. If I was the first thing I'm thinking here is Peter Jackson, Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Harry Wills, and Sam McVeigh. All would have at some point been a world champion if they had have been given the opportunity. And that isn't even because we've got the footage. It's to do with, you look at their careers, we've gone through it, how many times they fought each other and beat each other. They all beat Jack Johnson, who was the champion around at the time. But starting with Peter Jackson, never got his shot against John O'Sullivan because he was black. John O'Sullivan didn't fight him. He threw that colour line down, the colour bar, because he knew Peter Jackson would have beaten him. I believe Peter Jackson would have been a world champion. Sam Langford, so he would make my top 10, if you like, our top 10. Sam Langford beat Jack Johnson. If he'd have been given a chance, I believe Sam Langford beats Jack Johnson on. It might not have been just one fight. If they had a couple of fights, he would have beaten one, lost one, however it had gone. Joe Jeanette, another guy, would have beaten Jack Johnson. Harry Wills had the opportunity against Jack Dempsey. This is a tricky one because they were both sort of at their peaks of their career. If that fight had been made, it would have been a very interesting one. 3 fights, I think they would have won 1 each out of 3. Who knows who'd have won the third? And then from that, you've got Sam McVeigh as well, another guy that fought Jack Johnson and should have fought him. So these guys really should have been, when you look at that lineal history and you look at sort of Colbert and you look at Sullivan and Jeffries and Fitzsimmons, all these guys avoided them, and it wasn't just because they were black. They threw the colour bar out because they knew they were fantastic fighters, and it would have changed the whole landscape of that lineal heavyweight title. And I honestly believe these guys were good enough to do that. The next sort of 6 to 10, Zora Foley should have fought Floyd Patterson for me if he had have been given a chance, and Cuss didn't hide Patterson the way he did away. Tried to hide him from Liston, but he also hid him from Foley as well for me. Foley would have beaten Patterson. I just believe that. I thought he was a fantastic, exceptional fighter. Jimmy Bivens had his opportunity in 1943. If he'd have fought Lewis, I think he gives him all sorts of problems. Could have been a world champion, so I'd stick him in sort of 7. And then you got the other lot. Your Ken Norton's although he was a world champion, never won it in the ring. Come very close against Ali. Could have got that decision against Holmes as well. Another fantastic fight. Didn't get the title. Ernie Shavers on any day beats anyone if he lands that shot. And then the last one I sort of stuck on the list, I couldn't help myself, is Sir Henry Cooper. And it's because when I look at it and I think that, I know it was Cassius Clay and he was a kid and obviously he wasn't a champion at the time. He lands that left hook. All sorts of ripples happen in history. He then goes on to fight Sonny Liston. I'm not saying he beat Sonny Liston. Did he have the tools to? Maybe he would have been given the opportunity. And in the Jimmy Ellis situation, if the British Boxing Board of Control didn't get involved, then he would have fought him. It wouldn't have been postponed. He wouldn't have got injured. And I think he beats Jimmy Ellis. So that's why those are my 10 fighters that I really believe that I think they need to be stuck somewhere. And I don't know, just I'll laminate it if you like, just to make it confirm it. These top 10 guys were guys that never won world titles. That when you look at the course of history, they could have done for me, Sean, and it would have changed a whole lot. And a lot of it was the colour divide, which is quite sad.
It is quite sad. We've touched on it many, many times throughout the episode, and it's just something to hark back to. I think you've mentioned it and described it pretty well when you've gone through the list of why you would say these 10 guys you would have definitively felt they would have become world champions should circumstances have been different for them at that particular time. I mean, we could sit here and say it shoulda, woulda, coulda, of course, but genuinely some of these situations, if they would have been different politically, they would have been world champions. A lot of these guys, if not all of them, probably would have been world champions if things would have gone their way. Political things outside of the ring, things out of their control. I think they genuinely would, and I do believe you, and that's why I support that decision to sort of put that list out there. Lists are so subjective and so open to criticism all the time. It's so difficult to get someone else that will agree with the same list. People will listen to this episode and say, well, you forgot about X, Y, or Z. Well, yeah, of course, because that many fighters out there, it's unbelievable difficult to put a list together and it be the definitive list. No one agrees with any list out there. The Ring magazine could put a list out there and no one will agree with it 100%. Absolutely not. And that's how subjective it is about putting lists. But you just wanted to put something out there really list wise to sort of demonstrate that these fighters, given what we've spoken about, if their opportunities would have come to them, they would have been provided them, or things would have gone in a different way, politically, inside, outside of the ring, then maybe these probably would have been world champions. Again, if there would have been more titles, even though we hate having like too many titles, if there would have been maybe 2 titles at that time, maybe they would have become world champions, some of these guys. But this is the whole point of the episode, really. It's about the nearly men of the heavyweight division. It's great to talk about the heavyweight division. We love the heavyweight division. I think every boxing fan thrives off it. They really, really do. And it's great to go through and talk about all these different fighters of different eras that potentially could have been world heavyweight champions. But it's also good to get it out there for you guys that might not know about a lot of these fighters. Not everybody is a boxing historian. Not everybody looks into the depths of fighters 120 years ago. Not everybody's interested in fighters 120 years ago because things have significantly changed in the world. But it is good to bring their stories out just a little bit, just a small snapshot of them for you guys to then go out and do your little Google searches on them and do a bit of reading on them, because it is really compelling. It really compels us to sit here and talk about these fighters and just give you like this little snapshot, as we said, of an episode where you can think, oh, actually, I've enjoyed listening to talk about Jack Johnson or Peter Jackson or Sam Langford or Joe Jeanette or any of the other fighters. They'll go and Google it. You'll go and sit there and read about them all night. And if you're anything like us, you'll probably end up sitting there for 3 hours on end reading all sorts of different articles and different stories. And then by the end of the week, you've become a fully fledged boxing historian on a certain fighter because you've read that much of it and you've immersed yourself that much in him. It's unbelievable the amount of stuff that you can get access to these days to be able to do it. But it's been a great episode, Johnston. I've really thoroughly enjoyed doing it. A great bonus episode for fight fans in the midst of all these big fight previews that we are doing for the main feed. We do want to bring you these odd little episodes at least once a month to be able to give you something different to listen to on the main feed. But if you want to listen to some of the more specialised series, of course you've got Career Profiles, you've got a full season 1 of Legendary Nights to go and listen to, you've got The Darker Side of Boxing, of course, and then you've got some of the existing episodes in our feed, The Life and Times of the Promoter Life. There's so many different episodes that we've covered over the past couple of years that you could go back and probably rack through some of them, and they're still very, very, very relevant to listen to today. As always then, fight fans, ending the episode and telling you where to go to follow us. You can do that at BTR Boxing Pod on Twitter and the BTR Boxing Podcast Network on Facebook. If you've not already subscribed to us, please go and do it on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or any available podcasting app out there. If you are an Apple user, please go and leave us a 5-star rating and let us know what you enjoy about the podcast and anything that you want us to do going forward. Of course, we'll look to accommodate it. Fight fans, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for listening to this episode about the nearly men of the heavyweight division.